Good evening. Thank you for coming at such a tense time in the semester. Hello. First, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on unceded Musqueam territory, which I mispronounced grossly. I wish to thank once again Green College for having had me here. I'm still here, but that's, you know what I mean. And today I have the pleasure of welcoming two of my colleagues from Montreal. Léon Lo from Studio Feed, who's a graphic designer, and Stéphane Poirier from Stéphane Poirier Illustrator, who is an illustrator. And I've been working with Stéphane and with Studio Feed, which Léon rejoined after a long absence, working in printing a few years back. And I've been working with these two parties since at least 2006, I think, and 2007. And on this particular project, which is the main topic of this evening's talk, since 2011. So as you can see, as the talks go along, every one of these projects is something that is a kind of work of patience and that I let unfold over a long period, and which I'm probably capable of doing because there are no public expectations for most of these works. They are more like things that I can do in the long run and let evolve the way that I see fit. And sometimes also it's just a question of the accidents of time and the availability, because you have to understand that both Stéphane and Léon are working, doing a lot of commercial work, and somehow I have to take time away from this to do these improbable projects, which are less lucrative in terms of capital influx on the short term. But they are still financed, and I should thank also the Quebec Arts Council for having founded this improbability twice over. And I think it's fitting to end on this project also because it is both a work of friendship. I think that's how I managed to convince them, rope them into these improbable enterprises, and a work of time and of the written life that pulses within this long time. So we kind of close the dialectic with this third project, and this project called Costumes Nationaux, which in English would translate as national costumes, not to be mistaken with Costume National, which is a very expensive clothing brand from France, is about to become Les Oiseaux Civils, which means the civilian birds. And this is because a book appeared within the fictional structure that I was writing, whose title was The Repertory for Civilian Birds, which is basically a compendium that out-of-work teamsters in an imaginary city from which the narrator comes from have nothing to do, so they just meet in the public library and discuss the birds they've seen all day and write the ornithology manual for this imaginary city. And so they are the citizen birds or the civilian birds. And so I've evolved this bird together with Studio Feed, Léon, and Stéphane over the last few years. And it started out, strangely enough, as a request to illustrate images through text. Because Anouk, who's not here, who's a designer in the punk spirit, decided that the most beautiful book he'd seen recently was a compendium of costumes from the 1930s. And he asked Stéphane to make some really pretty images and imaginative images that would stem from this book. And then they said, maybe we'll bring Danielle in so that this can actually be about something, some kind of story can kind of create a context for all this. So in a way, I was asked to design words to fit with an illustrated project. And I took it into my hands to prove that words mean more and that they have a spark in a life of their own which can carry the project into unexpected directions. I got the project financed. I started directing the thing. And now it's going to be a novel, basically. And so Costumes Nationaux over the years invented its own shape. It came into the world as a sort of catalog, but right from the beginning it wanted to become something else, something strange and new, which is exactly the etymology of novel. That's where it comes from. In French, we turn towards the language, we call it roman, the Romance languages, so maybe this is a romance of the novel, in a sense. It was shaped through time, through the attention, the displacement of the new, within the deeper time of reading and the memory of reading, and the deeper bonds of friendship and conversation. Because in a way, this project is a work of oral literature because it involved endless phone calls with each of these parties and also meetings on the side with each of them to kind of shape what might be drawn and what might be constructed as graphic design, and always in the deferred time of creating a website, which is not like when you're doing a film and everybody meets on the set and then you're creating the thing. The set was always displaced in time. It was always in deferred time that this was done. And so I would react also to the work that was being done on both sides and then try to shape this flow into the final object. So this is in a sense the story of a book I did not intend to write, that through talking and writing, through paying heed to the wonders, the enigma, sometimes the violence of the world, because it was very much sustained by whatever was catching our fancy at the time that we're coming up with the episodes. And a lot of it comes from the Financial Times and cutting articles in it or looking at whatever was current and trying to twist it into another shape. And so in a way, the book was taken by a life of its own and became sort of bird-like. It escaped. And we didn't quite know what it is, and we'll only know what it is once I'm done rewriting it. So it's a book that through a 7-year journey presented itself to me and revealed a worldview, a kind of worldview, like a sort of landscape in flight. I would say that the project has something to do with a view from nowhere. So it's a parallel vision of this reality to an invented reality. I'm borrowing the title from a book I've never read, which is The View from Nowhere from Thomas Nagel. And I think it's a very strong formula, this idea of a view from nowhere. But I have read other books by Thomas Nagel. I quite like him. He is quite annoying to the scientists, for example, because one of his last books was called Why the Darwinian evolutionary view of consciousness is almost certainly wrong. And this created a lot of debate. Not that he does not believe in Darwin, that is not at all the point, but his position is always the fact that somehow this distinction between subjective and objective, that objectivity is really a way of perceiving yourself as being folded into the world and being a consequence of it in a certain sense, and being this strange loop inside the world, looking at the world, but able also to take a step away from it. Just like fiction does, because some of us elect to believe in fictions and somehow we find ourselves one step behind ourselves, looking at ourselves from the outside. And this is what I would call the view from nowhere, that literature, poetry, and a lot of the arts are able to bring us into a way of detaching from ourselves, of being always somewhere and elsewhere at the same time. And the question that philosophically Nagel asks, and which has given rise to epithets such as a beautiful but untenable position, which is exactly what I'm going for, is the question of why was this power given to the living? Why was somehow this power of this fold of consciousness, why is it there? And mostly how is it there rather than why? And in a way, philosophy always falls off the ladder of logic and bounces against paradox and then free falls into infinity. I'll let you to ponder that thing. But there's always this notion that we're bounded by these paradoxes and that there's always this enigma, this light of enigma, and whatever you want to call it. Nobody has explained the world up to now. People have explained aspects of the world, but explaining the world is just something that's not done. It's not very polite. So it's a form of philosophy in flight that's trying to catch a glimpse of our true nature and this light that becomes. And so in a way, fiction is a way to accept the enigma and to deepen it. This is a very good quote, which you can see why it would enrage some people. The existence of our universe might be explained by scientific cosmology, but such an explanation would still have to refer to features of some larger reality that contained or gave rise to it. A scientific explanation of the Big Bang would not be an explanation of why there was something rather than nothing, because it would have to refer to something from which that event arose. This something or anything, these are great words, something, anything, Why something? Why this? Very famous philosophical paper. This something or anything else cited in a further scientific explanation of it would then have to be included in the universe whose existence we are looking for an explanation of when we ask why there is anything at all. This is a question that remains after all possible scientific questions have been answered. So these questions that remain, in a way the question that always remains is c'est quoi ça l'univers, which is from a popular Quebec song. The universe, what's that? And that is the question that I am humbly going for with this particular fiction project. Science, or more largely any form of knowledge, including the knowledge that avows itself as incomplete, cannot reduce the world to itself and exhaust it. Everything would be whisked out of being, it seems. Nothing but nature is purely naturalistic. And this is often something you'll get as a criticism of fiction. You know, yes, but it's not true. But it carries a kind of truth, a kind of displacement of the truth. And so, once again, this reveling in the beautiful but untenable position of literature, I think there are ways to access it. Ever since, I have discovered the emotion of the fictive, the emotion of fiction, the emotion of literature, which way before practicing literature was something that beckoned me to it, that welcomed me into it. I've been wanting to question this perspective, to twist it around. What would it be like, that view from nowhere, from the perspective of fiction and literature itself? Because when you abandon yourself to the arts of language and situate yourself within the shaping of language, this language that is social, that has been given to you, somehow you are taking a step behind yourself and behind even the being of fiction. And you enter into this position where you're using fiction as a kind of lens or kind of telescope, where you learn things that you didn't know that you knew about the world. So fiction is a part of reality, but no one would confound ever, except in certain extreme cases, would ever mistake it completely for reality. It always seems instead of just being. And so, in a way, I had this image while writing the project. This project was written as a novelization, a feuilleton, which means that it was broadcast over the web in episodes over a period of almost 5 years. And so I discovered things about it that we didn't know at the start. And I always have this image that somehow we have inside ourselves a view of ourselves that is gone. And when people say memory is a construction, memory is the closest chamber to the imagination. And I kept being visited by this image somehow of a childlike version of yourself, that child that discovered the emotion of literature and then wanted to become that adult that would write literature, that is somehow turning its back to you and facing the landscape of memory and disappearing into the landscape of memory, suddenly entering a place of the imagination, which is where fiction goes, in between memory, presence, and imagination. Whoa, this is metaphysical. But so in a way, fiction puts its finger down in reality to kind of tell us the path to the counter-earth. This is Nabokov putting his finger down, probably unsatisfied by the service of the waiter. It's what happens when you're a fallen upper-class prince. And Ada, or Ardor, which was his highly criticized book that followed upon Lolita and Superstardom, is set in a parallel version of this planet where its inhabitants have discovered that somehow we inhabit their blood and that all possible worlds are flowing within their blood. And in this parallel reality, one character named Daniel Van Veen writes for the Journal of Quebec Studies. And the Canada is named Canady, and the whole north of North America is named Estotiland. And this is because Nabokov fell upon a map where you can see up on the top left corner, North America is known as Estotilandia. Nobody knows the etymology of this. I don't anyhow, so if somebody does, please share it during the period question. But it's seen after that on maps of New France. But there's a fan actually on a website that tried to locate the main city of Canady, which is called Lador. And he concluded that it was located in the same space-time coordinates as La Dorée in Quebec, which is a tiny little village of 835 people, and that the St. Lawrence River does not exist in this parallel world, and that somehow there is a hole or a kind of umbilic, a kind of belly button tying the realities together, a hole in nothing between these two places. I'm going to go with my shovel later this winter and try to check if this is true. And in a way, every book is a kind of knot and space-time and a kind of hole and nothing, where the possibilities, the potentialities of fiction open up a kind of hatch or kind of knot between worlds. Because, and we ourselves, as folds in time, meet in a book another fold in time that kind of gets us into the graininess of things, the sensation of time, the texture of space-time in a certain sense. And in a way, when I look on my writing ambitions, once I had a formula, which I'm going to use tonight, but I said, what I'm trying to do up to a point is to reconcile this feeling that this child that I was, discovering the feeling of literature, to reconcile this feeling with what I now know about maybe life, literature, experience, etc., and to kind of carry over all the innocence of the naivete and the naive science and knowledge of the child projecting himself or herself in books, and to carry it into an adult endeavor without the usual connotations of that world. And then during adolescence, when I was being questioned when I would put out these books I was supposed to write. Like one of the pastimes was, as many children of the 1980s, 70s, 80s, was playing Dungeons and Dragons, and somehow this really informed my poetics. Now I'm not ashamed to say anymore. But I became the dungeon master, so I became the author of the adventures, and in a way I would just hide behind this, you know, you would hide when you play Dungeons and Dragons, you hide behind the module, and I would be reading whatever I was supposed to communicate to the players, and then I would start improvising after a while and not tell them that we had completely abandoned the precincts of the pre-written adventure, and that I was just making up landscapes as we went along, and conversations and strange episodes. And to me, this gave me confidence in a sense. Then I read Beckett and stuff like that, and everything went wrong. And I was interested always in the fantastical elements within these structures, and also this fascination for maps, which are kind of narrative where you're like, okay, I'll just project myself into this image, and I'll be traveling around, so no need to write it, it's all going to happen to me. And role-playing games, in a way, carry you into this world. And so this is Stéphane's work, which has different levels of refinement. We sat down one day with this idea of making a book of costumes, and then we said, okay, we kind of have to make up a traveler that's going to be the excuse for describing all these people from imaginary countries. And in a way, this is the first summary of the work. It's just this doodle done in his office, which used to be 1 block away from my house. I would drop by at all kinds of inopportune hours to be discussing the projects, then make a phone call to feed, and just disrupt their old capitalist working day. But they found it fun, and somehow I was charming enough for this to work. And in a way, Stéphane will develop on this and explain how it got fleshed out. And he will also show you all the levels of his drawing skill. And this character emerged because the first 2 episodes were more like descriptions of a kind of imaginary Mitteleuropa, and then a travel inspired a bit by Ivan Platonov's fiction of communist Russia, with titles such as The Invention of Electricity in Ukraine, and where I just invented this power plant in the middle of a mystical zone where people have Cartesian practices, but they're tribes, and all these philosophical questions so I just made up this kind of Russia of the swamp. And this character emerged was a guy who was asked to go on this mission to describe this world. And I named him Anatole, and I realized I named him Anatole because of one of my childhood idols, which is this character named Philemon, which I spoke about last year here at Green. And this is his donkey, which talks and usually is telling him not to do certain of the things he wants to do, and he's always a little bit afraid. And he's a farm boy, But all he does is look at the terrestrial globe, at the globe, and project himself on the letters of the Atlantic Ocean. And there's as many albums in this collection of bande dessinée as there are letters to the Atlantic Ocean. So he travels to actual A-shaped islands, T-shaped islands, L-shaped islands, A-N-T-I-C. And each of the episodes is about finding a way to reach these worlds. For example, blowing up a conch and then walking through this corridor and appearing in this other world. And then an image that really struck me in childhood was this one. He's landed through blowing up a seashell. He's landed inside this little rocky outcrop, so he's not on one of the letters of the ocean. And he wants to reach the A, and the only way to reach the A, the lighthouse keeper tells him, is to wait for the lighthouse to land, which is this owl, which projects like corridors of light through its eyes. And they're able to walk inside this suspended corridor until morning. But they have to reach their destination before morning because then the light will fade and they'll fall into the ocean. This shaped my mind. But this particular adventure, it really stayed with me. It's called Philémon and the Suspended Castle. I cannot highly recommend it enough. And I mixed this in a way, and this is about the encounter of these childhood encounters with literature and these very adult encounters, with the story of Stéphane Mallarmé, who lost his son Anatole at a very early age and wrote this incomplete poem called A Tomb for Anatole, which is a staggering work of deuil, of grieving. And he was also the poet of creating worlds through only language. You know, this is a very famous example. Sur les crédences, au salon vide, nul ptix abolit bibelot d'inanité sonore, car le maître est allé puiser des pleurs aux styx avec ce seul objet dont le néant sonore. So the ptix, which is the main rhyming object at the end of the first verse, that is nothing at all, but that seems like an animal, that seems like a kind of bird, that seems a kind of crystalline creation of nothing and something. That seems like the universe itself. And to me, this longing, this tombeau, and the honor of the lost child, these turns of phrase that structure a kind of crystalline event in the void, is what we were reaching for with this costumes project. And to have this feeling for what exists, to honor what does not quite exist, the reality of feelings, of fictions, of words and light, and to follow that child out of memory and back to here, back to these green tidings of the imagination. So I will leave the stage to Stéphane, who will more concretely bring us closer to the project. Sorry, I forgot my slides and all this lyricism. This is Anatole, and this is a pattern.
So things are going to get a bit more concrete now. So yeah, I'm the illustrator of the project. As Daniel said, it's a project that lasted about 5 to 8 years, and I've been there since the beginning. And in the project, we can see about 40 different characters, illustrations, and buildings and places like this. And so I'm really happy to talk to you about this strange project. It's hard to summarize such a project that lasted such a long time. It never was a straight line. So, looking back at my whole life, when I was a boy, I wanted to become a scientist, simply a scientist. And though I studied science for much of my life, I ended up somehow being an illustrator. Life is full of unexpected turns. And the only common ground between these ambitions in science and my current work in illustration must be all those science books and knowledge books that I read when I was young. Reading is a big word because I mostly looked at the pictures. These kinds of book could fit in that that sort of old bookcase. And this was my favorite book at the time. I knew this book by heart. it was the field guide of books of Eastern North America. And I was really into bird watching, and I did bird assignments at school. Only these were my Pokemons, I guess. And this was my hero at the time. It was the author of that field guide, Roger Torrey Peterson. He was the first ornithologist to invent a way to identify birds without shooting them down. So he invented a whole system of arrows, and he wrote he tried to translate with words the song of the bird. And I was quite shocked at the time to realize that he did all the drawings himself, and he was such a masterful artist. And he worked all his life, and this is his very last plate. He did at age 88. And it pushed me to make my own books when I was young, not because I was into book design, but because I like to transmit knowledge, and because I simply like birds. And 25 years later, I did my own children's book documentary about electric fish. This is an electric eel, by the way. And I've studied architecture after I failed 4E in engineering. And at school in Montreal, the teachers weren't really into the architect craze of the late 90s, and they always pushed us to respect the building's program and its context and its use. So I kind of learned that way, and I kind of learned to ditch any heavy personal style in my work. So I've worked with by changing my style with every project I work on, where content drives style and not the opposite. And I do a bit like those books I liked when I was young. I do informative graphics and posters for book fairs and poetry books. And I always like contracts that are challenging and that push me forward, and that's why I really like to work with Daniel and Whitfield. Daniel always challenged me to go further in my practice. It's hard to speak in English. And this was our first project together. It was a collection of texts about food and everything related to food. And I got to know Daniel and his obsession with details and with content. And also I got to know Studio Feed, and their strong work and strong talent. And after that, we worked on A1, which was part computer game, part some kind of fold-away booklet where Daniel recounts his childhood dream jobs, ambitions as a boy. And later, not with Feed this time, but with graphic designer Julie Espinas, we worked on La Société des Grands Fonds, which was a collection of texts published on a website, a bit like Costumes Nationaux right now, but it became a book only last year. And we also worked on a geographical map that could be in some page of the Antiterra Atlas. And we can see the A of Philemon. And again, this map, it explored all the territories in La Société des Grands Fonds. And again, we started it in 2013 only to finish it last year. So there was some kind of 5-year hiatus between the first version and the last. So, working with Daniel, there's always something strange with the flow of time. Time flows differently, and sometimes it's a bit slower, and I have to reconcile two parts of my career. Sometimes I feel like I'm in a spaceship with Daniel and Einstein, going at the speed of light, where time slows down, while on Earth I'm dealing with spinning clocks and swift deadlines and of my depressing professional life. And one thing we did with Feed was this little booklet in 2011. We called ourselves CPF at the time, which is a bit like a prog band. It was just a little booklet. I have it on the table here. It was the beginning of a story, a beginning of something that we thought could become bigger. There were only 3 different characters and an unnamed narrator. And the only thing sure about this booklet was that it was incomplete, and we had to finish it somehow, and we'd have to wait another 3 years in order to give it the form that it has today. This booklet, like Daniel said, was inspired by beautiful costume books like this one, which is called National Costumes. Sometimes this one was quite beautiful with vivid colors and quirky characters. And we all know these kind of pages. We've all seen them in dictionaries and encyclopedias. It's almost a cliche, and we thought it would be interesting to take that canon and to make it ours and to distort it and to play with it. And when you look at those poor people and all crammed in their page, they're all sweaty and forced to wear all the stereotypical clothes of their culture. We thought if we wrapped a narration around them, they will become more than mere showroom dummies and become flesh and blood characters. And when you look at a plate in a costume book, it can remind you of a plate of books like Peterson did. And funnily, most of the great costume books were done by one person who did the research, the writing, and all the illustrations. A bit like my favorite bird watcher, like Auguste Racinet, Michel Leloir, who did a fantastic dictionary of costume all his life, and Émile Gallois, who's a bit less known. So they kind of work as bird watchers, but instead of drawing feathers, they draw dresses, with some kind of detached glance. So inspired by these, historians and artists, Daniel invented Anatole, who's some kind of columnist in a magazine. We can think of like National Geographic or the New Yorker, and you will travel abroad and write columns for the magazine. And this is the same map that Daniel showed, but I did my best this time. Yeah, that was for a grant application. So Anatole would start in some kind of late 19th century old Europe town, and would travel visiting a lot of different territories, like a bit like Phileas Fogg. And he would end up in some kind of weird utopian post-fashion world, where people are dressed like Yushi Yokoyama's mangas. But Anatole didn't really do that trip as we planned, of course. Things got weird. So in order to play the role of Anatole's hand, I have to channel his hand and learn to draw, because I wasn't really good with figures and with clothing, so it was a bit tedious to learn. And also I had to deal with the fact that I'm not even a costume designer. So it was a double imposter syndrome. And also I had not only to draw two-dimensional characters, but also to get to know them and to make apparent their personality and their story. But I figured that if my 10-year-old son can do character studies like this, maybe I could just take a chill pill and do the work. So every time we start, this is one slide, too much. When I usually illustrate a text, I usually wait for the words to arrive, and then I read, and then I work. But this time it's all it's all organic and a bit backward. We meet first, and before any word is ever written and any draft is ever started, we just meet and talk. And Léon will talk a bit about this process later. And Daniel will send me press clippings without any context, just to build something together, to build a common ground for Daniel to write and me to design the characters, and to Léon to design his props. So Anatole's adventure evolved by being nourished by our own evolving reality and our changing tastes and our books we'd read and news articles we'd read. So here's an example of transforming real images and into a character. The construction of a character. So we wanted to do some kind of electric engineer whose mission is to bring electricity into the swamps. And I just finished at the time a book about Tesla's life, and he had such an interesting life, strange life. And we thought our electrical engineer could be some kind of Tesla's doppelganger. And I stumbled upon a lot of images of different communication military agents from Poland and people wearing tinfoil hats. So I did this crude drawing I can barely look at. And I'm pretty alone when I do that, so sometimes I have to model for myself. Here holding a coffee bag and a broom. And this is the final version after like 10 versions of my electrical engineer, who kind of looks like Tesla, and who has a dove also that he really, really loves. So every drawing, every cloth, every character and building has one foot in some reality and one foot in fiction, and all mixed up in some kind of fever dream. This is a thief we had to invent, and thinking of a thief we thought of The Three Robbers by late great Tommy Ungerer. It's a children's book. And we thought also of a magpie, because magpies are perky thieves. So and I had this picture of haunting pictures of Dutchmen wearing some kind of bell-shaped hat. So it became our magpie thief, who's and she's she's drifting away from the page because she's a thief. And this is General Maire, who was supposed to be a military woman, captain of a ship. We didn't want her to be dressed in any military garment. We wanted her to be badass chic, with the cold stance of Pina Bausch, and a dress that she could have taken from Georgia O'Keeffe closet. So here she is. And this one I really like. Basically it's a kid that got lost in the underground realms of a school, and somehow he survived by eating phosphorescent mushrooms. And honestly, I thought it was hilarious to do a naked man in a project called nationaux. And as the story evolved, we were more interested in showing people in real clothes, less like a bit more like a documentary, because Anatole was a bit tired of his job, and I was more illustrating real characters then. And I put other examples, but I don't think I have any time. Peter Forkin, and a teacher that's kind of avant-garde. So we're stepping out of the dictionary. These were the 3 first characters, and they really look like characters I would have stolen from any costume books. And gradually, as the story progressed, things got weird and absurd. And we have here some kind of ghost of a captain and 2 mythical figures, 2 statues. And these are the last 2 characters of the chapter 8, the last chapter. We've got a beam of light and a bird flock, so things have evolved. And it's my last farewell to Mr. Peterson. And the book Civilian Birds there will be illustration in it, but maybe I'll have to redraw them in another style. I don't know. I'll have to wait and listen to Anatole. And the story will progress. And this is a stain on the Studio Feed's concrete floor. And somehow it's going to become the island in which Anatole will continue his adventure. But anyway, we'll have to work with a lot of patience. Or Daniel.
Thank you. I'm Léon Lo. I work at Studio Feed, so we take on the graphic design aspects of the project, amongst other things. I don't know if any one of you have had a chance to visit the actual website. You'll get a little preview here. Flags, lots of text, pretty images, beautiful costumes, descriptions. And it's all flowing in a very vertical manner. You can also get a look at a layer underneath, which is called the carnet national, which translates to literally the national notebook. So a scrapbook of sorts, filled with the documentation, inspirations, and interpretations. The whole thing kind of has the effect of looking at a river from a bird's eye view, but with the added feature of being able to peel the skin off the water to get a good look at the riverbed, the understory. I started getting involved with costumes nationaux more fully, starting from chapter 4 of 8. At that point, the process for each chapter kind of started with discussions where Daniel and Stéphane and Feed would, Daniel would come with some ideas of maybe some characters, some places, some actions that would happen. We would talk about it and bounce ideas back and forth. After which, when things got a bit, when certain themes started to emerge, we'd get into research and go and dig or fish as much as we could and looked around all the possibilities of everything. At some point, Daniel would have started to firm up the story and we'll have an almost final version of the story which he would communicate to us. And at that point, it started getting clear what needed to be done. On our end, Stéphane would know the characters or the costumes to illustrate the places, and we would have a clear idea of the visual elements to produce for that chapter. Now, we do graphic design. This is obviously not a picture of a graphic designer. This is a prop designer, and this is a notion I'll get back to a bit later. And the very final step would be layout, where we would take all of the elements and place them in a visually pleasing way and put them online for everyone to enjoy. So basically discussion, research, text, design, and layout all going in a fairly linear way. So that was like chapter 4. That's how the process went. Getting back to the idea of props, or movie props, theater properties, I like to think of what Studio Feed produces as narrative properties, or properties of the story, properties that are there to serve the story. So in the research phase, we're really bombarded with a lot of stimulus coming from very different places, and all of it, absolutely all of it, is interesting. So it's quite easy to get lost, but we have to somehow make sense of that. And on our end, I have to start thinking about the signs that need to be produced, what needs to be said, and how it will manifest itself visually. So it's an exercise of synthesis that needs to happen there. When we look at theater props, they're not very, they're not the most beautiful objects in the world. In fact, some of them are very ugly. The proportions are all wrong. They're gaudy. They're kind of flimsy looking. But they serve a purpose. Basically, when they're up on stage, they're telegraphing what they are to the person that's all the way at the back of the room. So they're basically screaming their identity at you, so that there's no room for any ambiguity. And to do that, sometimes you really have to exaggerate things. You really have to go a little overboard. And you know, it may not be the prettiest thing, but at least it'll get the message across. So this is kind of how I was approaching the design of the property, the narrative property. So some of the examples, obviously flags, as Anatole would travel to a different place every chapter. So a different flag for every chapter. Every place has a history, has aspirations, so how to kind of synthesize that in an abstract, or not always so abstract way, and realize it in a flag. A lot of insignias representing different things. If we look at the examples, there's a lot of stylistic signposts that hint subtly or not so subtly at certain time periods, certain places, certain contexts. On the bottom left, we can see a sailor's tattoo. It gives you a very different, the sense of a very different context than the Gloin Ballet glass house insignia, gold-leafed with the golden rose key. So all these things are kind of exaggerated to telegraph their identity to you. We made lots of ephemera, things that help to build the worlds. Train tickets, radio calling cards, shifty space program costume patches. And each chapter number, we try to look for a new physicality to them, kind of as an exercise to make it fun, to try and not repeat ourselves. And possibly the most interesting and most important props that we produced were the books, the visual manifestation of the stories within the stories that Daniel would think up, or that would come out, emerge from of their own will. Here we have the Stereolale Sifil, the bird encyclopedia that gave its name to this lecture, and more stories and potential stories. So getting back to the chapter 4 model of the process, which was a linear flow from discussion, research, text, design to layout. If we take the analogy of the river again, it was something of a laminar flow, kind of easygoing, sort of clear. And over the course of time, it started getting muddy. Things started getting complicated. The envelopes were pushed, the boundaries were pushed in search for how to go beyond the boundaries, the aesthetic boundaries of the initial exercise. There's this will of transcendence, of trying to find, trying to explore the possibilities that were clearly opening up as the story progressed. So this linear process, or this simple equation, started looking more like this, where every step was informing every other step at all times. So it was a much more porous experience. It was incredibly stimulating and incredibly frustrating as well. But we all came out the richer for it. One example is in chapter 7, I was researching boats. At that point, the story had been pretty firmed up, and I came across the Habcock aircraft that was dreamed up by an inventor named Geoffrey Pike. Winston Churchill had wanted him to materialize a ship, an aircraft carrier in the middle of the Atlantic off the coast of Labrador. It would have been made of ice, a mixture of ice and wood, this mixture called pykrete. It would have been undetected by the enemies and easily repaired. It didn't exist. So I was very taken by this story and told Danielle about it, and was hoping that somehow this ice boat would make it into the story. And even though the story had already pretty much been written at that point, Danielle somehow transformed it into not a boat, but Colonel Picretti, the Man of Ice. So it actually ended up making its way into the story. So just an example of how different steps of the processes were influencing each other at that point. In chapter 4, Anatole, the main protagonist, somehow disappears and goes flowing into an underground river or something like that. And this hole in the story actually somehow gave way to a physical manifestation where he sent an envelope containing the first 3 chapters to us, to the physical world. The envelope is actually there on the table. So it's filled with his correspondences, the various costumes he's seen, the ephemera he's picked up, and his national notebook with all of the research and inspirations. And it was it points to the potential of the story to transcend its initial place, kind of jumping out, the river jumping out of its riverbed. If you go to the website now, at the very end of chapter 8, the final chapter, you'll find these 2 words filled with promise, à suivre, to be continued. The irony being that, of course, Costumes Nationaux will not continue. Rather, there will not be anything added to this website, but rather the story itself is looking to continue. It is alive, it is living, and it's just looking for an opportunity to manifest itself again in another form, to prove the open and full potential of the story of the book. Thank you very much.
Oh, I have everybody's notes. Well, what time? 6? 6? Yes. Okay. Just to talk about the future of this project, as promised, I decided it was not going to be called Costumes Nationaux anymore, which was very much the title that we came up with to do this catalog of costumes, but civilian birds. And the only image you have of the main character, except the evocative images of Mallarmé or others, is this empty blue coat, which he's left in his empty apartment, and his editor, his publisher, goes looking for him with the intern from the editorial house who has to deliver flowers every day to his door. And basically this is the only glimpse we get of him and the words themselves that embody this character. And maybe you've noticed on the title of, on the book covers of these imaginary books, but all of the books are made up of kind of mashups of languages from this world. So, you know, we have these nice tools like Google Translate now. You don't have to be James Joyce anymore. You just go and I would think of a culture that would be like slightly Scandinavian and mixed with some German stuff. And then I would start playing with the radicals and make up words. And so Storiolar Civil, for example, it's a mix of two kinds of Gaelic and some Flemish, I think. And then I don't remember after a while, but it just, when it starts sounding good to my ear, I'm like, this is it. So it's, and which is fun. And these terms are of course known in language as portmanteau, which I find highly hilarious because the only thing you see of the character is basically this, which is a portmanteau. And so you'll have words like, for example, Mylog, which is Anatole's favorite coffee house. It's called the Little Milk, and the city that it comes from is kind of a mix of Brussels, Montreal, and Glasgow, which are all like major minor cities. And so there's a lot of political discourse also weaved into this frou-frou stuff. And Berglios is the mountain of knowledge. So in the third chapter, which is what decides him to quit all this corporate work he's doing for the luxury bourgeois upper class magazine, The New Yorker. And he's basically leaving his job because he meets his childhood friend on this mountain, which is a country that has declared its independence in the name of the education of children. And so it's a school that's completely, somewhat like Green College, completely like incorporated within these woodlands and these cave systems. And that's where the mushroom man is hiding, because he's just gone down below Graham House. And he's now somewhere in the lost stacks of the of the library down there, which does not have enough books. But so in the end, you have all these adventures kind of correspond to different questions, philosophical questions about the nature of the world, things that worry me. Art and society, colonialism and technology, education and freedom, lost love, portrait of us in our own absence, so the question of death, disappearance, shipwreck and salvage, hope, and the very notion that we are made of the same substance that stories are made of, which is light. And the new book, the book that no publisher has yet accepted, but that I will manage to do in some way or another, is because I haven't submitted it anywhere, and I am going to Brussels to work on it in January, February. And I think we're going to have to add some birds at the beginning of each chapter, just because Stéphane is asking for it. And one of the models for this book, I think it should be somewhat like these illustrated editions of the classics. For example, this is for the centenary of Les Belles Lettres, which publishes all the Latin, Greek authors, and French. They have these illustrated editions with Bible thin papers and these black and white illustrations. And they've ordered different illustrations, different illustrators to accompany these books into the 21st century. It's a very nice thing they did. And they're pocket books, but they're done with such elegance. They're kind of like your own little Ovid metamorphosis. This is the Metamorphosis, of course. And they're done as your kind of little pocket versions of these great classics. And of course, the website, like the joke is that it's just 2 pages that scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll. I actually asked, I used to be a new media director here in town, and I asked the programmer the first year I ever did one of these projects, how far can you scroll down? There's actually a limit. There's an edge of the world on the web. So the episodes at the beginning, they were very short, 5,000 words on one page. And then in the end, they're like 14,000, 16,000 words. And I would just hand them this pile of paper when they were expecting like a bunch of vignettes, and a little thing to illustrate the illustrations. I'm like, no. We're doing a real work of literature. So this is Stéphane and this is me. And I think one example for this endeavor is this beautiful edition of Moby Dick by Rockwell Kent, who worked on it for 5 or 7 years, I think, and put out this edition, which is now reproduced in cheaper conditions, but that has, I think, like 400 illustrations or something like that. And it makes for these incredible pages, which really create like an enchantment with the object of the book. I want this, but unfortunately, I'm going to have to buy it at Sotheby's by stealing a car. And in a way also the other, and once again in the spirit of reconciling this childhood grasp of what literature is, its potentiality and whatever I discovered later on. Alice in Wonderland is of course an example, and it's interesting, this is actually Lewis Carroll's little hand edition of his little dream book, which is kind of the quality of my, in a way, my drawings, my doodles, the things that you start up with, and the book transforms. This is the edition I actually have at home, which is a book club edition from New York and from Random House in New York. Very beautiful edition with all colored illustrations, the tennial illustrations. So there's this idea that the work that Stéphane did, in a way, it's now become indissociable. It's impossible to distinguish from, and the work that Léon did and the other guys at Feed did, it's part of it. So somehow we have to honor all that as a thing that will accompany these two things, this literature and the images that came out of it and that speak to it, will go with each other like 2 strands of the same river, 2 currents in the same river. And this notion actually of the fictional self, I think it really comes across with Charles Dodgson, who creates this persona of Lewis Carroll based on a little girl he meets in photographs with his family, Alice Liddell, who then becomes Alice, and here we see the imaginary Alice spying on the sleeping real Alice. And somehow Anatole is looking for this whole that will allow him to go beyond the purview of fiction and into whatever fiction turns back to. And I don't think I said it at the beginning, I skipped over it, but the word univers, right? C'est quoi ça l'univers? What's that, the universe? What's that? It comes from uni, right, which means united, one thing, and versus, which means the back of, or to turn towards. So in a way, it's almost like seeing consciousness as the universe turning upon itself. And that's what I think from his own purview, his own reality, his own view from elsewhere, Anatole is looking under the light of another sun for this funnel, this all and nothing. And this island where he winds up at the end, and of course I can evoke once again another great classic of childhood, which is Treasure Island. Here you have Robert Louis Stevenson, who told the story to his adopted son, Lloyd Osbourne. And Lloyd Osbourne himself became a writer later in life, but he is the child to which Treasure Island is told to, so he's the child in memory. And somehow this tale also started with this very precise drawing of an island that then gave way to this book. And I would say that the last model for this, because now I want to write a sequel called Black Dot Island, where people are going to get off the Patience, the ship of hope that is commandeered, that is under the command of Généralement, which means General Mother, which I thought was a perfect title for the leader of somebody who bases our whole work on the salvage of hope within a broken world. And it's The Wizard of Oz, which is basically the story of several failed, let's say, brittle characters that go off into this other world and seek through friendship with one another a kind of solution to their own ill perception of themselves. And of course, this is also a mirror world, like Nabokov's Antiterra, which is Oz, Australia. And most of the features on this map, which featured in the second, I think there's 18 books of Oz. Most people only read the first one. But in the second one, there's this map that appears, which Frank Bohm drew, and which has some mirror features with several regions of Australia. And so on Black Dot Island, this island, which is kind of, you know, when Stéphane showed you these very strange images from Yokohama of these, well, how did you say it? You said the post-costume, post-fashion, people dressed in geometrical shapes with faces that take photographs and stuff. So this became this island, which one day during one of the meetings where I barged into the corporate environment, I had to wait because they had a meeting with more important people with money. And I basically photographed the floor while I was waiting. And I said, this is where it's going to happen, the sequel. And it was behind the chairs of one of Léon's partners, Raphael, there. And I had to wait. I had another coffee, so probably my brain was going a little bit too fast. And in a way, what happens at the very end of this 8 chapters, that they're traveling in this ship of hope, and they have rescued an orbital DJ who was betrayed by his own son. I shouldn't say that, but actually was betrayed by a man named Beat, like a betterave. And he's part of a kind of conspiracy who believes more in the feelings of machine than the feelings of humanity. And on this island, what I want him to do is to engage in these dialogues with a machine that has been loved too much. And this machine somehow will entertain him in this palace of light and tell him of the hole between worlds and what is beyond that light, that fiction, which appears in the vistas of fiction. And so these are my basic ideas for it. And I know he's going to travel on the island with 4 of his shipmates. And they're all going to disappear in some way into whatever calls from outside their own story. And so this machine, in a way, I saw it appear one winter, and winter is good for making photos. But the rest, I don't enjoy so much. But this was during a meeting in Stéphane's office, and I just saw this perfect shadow being cast. It's not because I'm not listening to what he's saying, but I saw this perfect shadow of a flower, kind of this immaterial flower being cast on the wall. And that to me kind of summarizes the kind of space that I want Anatole to enter to dialogue with this machine of emotional excess, which does not understand why so much emotion was given to her or it, or however she wants to call herself, and why humanity kind of gave up on itself and its name. So there it is.